The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand, and we gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise, to get what we want, we got to organize.
Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night, good people, good comrades, wherever you are in the world. This is another episode of the Pantsula Podcast, presented to you by the All African People's Revolutionary Party, or the A-APRP. The objective, of course, of the A-APRP is a unified Africa under scientific socialism. If you have any questions as to what that means for us, for the African world and people in general, you can go to the website aaprp-intl.org. You can also contact us. We will be glad to assist you in any way we can. I want to introduce a new comrade to the Pantsula Podcast experience. Comrade Salifu is here with us. We also have Comrade Sadiq. Comrade Salifu, what's up?
Peace, everybody. Peace, Africans, especially. How y'all doing out there? I'm excited to be here on the Pantsula Podcast with my comrades. Let's get into this, man.
Yeah, what's up? So, of course, before we start any episode, we must give honor to the ancestors, because without the work they did, we would have no work to honor them, to continue what they did. Without them, there is none of this, anything we do. So let's go. Who are the ancestors we are honoring this episode, comrade?
Yeah, so today we're going to first honor Hosea Hudson. He is an African born in the southern states in the United States, specifically Georgia. He actually was an active organizer, part of the Communist Party. He struggled around things like voter rights, amongst many other things. This is at the height of the Red Scare, as we all know, the anti-communist wave, which is still prevalent as we see today during that time. So much love and commemoration to Hosea Hudson. Second ancestor that we're commemorating this to was another member of a Communist Party in the United States, one known as the Communist Party of the USA. Charlene Mitchell, she was a international socialist, feminist, labor and civil rights activist. In 1968, she became the first African woman candidate for the president of the United States. She's also had a long history of struggling alongside with Angela Davis, who they together founded the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression campaign on behalf of the defenses of Joanne Little and the Wilmington 10, when she focused her activism on anti-apartheid efforts as well. So much commemoration to Charlene Mitchell.
Ashe, Ashe. It's interesting you mention these two ancestors, because something recently came up. It's been happening for many, many decades, but here's another iteration of it. There's, in the United States, there's a Congress, there's a Senate, but the mass of Republicans in the Congress have come up with H-Con Res 9. So it's Resolution 9, a congressional resolution 9, which is denouncing the horrors of socialism. So if you can't tell, study the history of the US, one of the many histories, and the premise of many histories of the US is anti-communism, and this is just one of the many resolutions of that. So denouncing the horrors of socialism, and the description is the concurrent resolution. Whereas socialist ideology necessitates a concentration of power that has time and time again collapsed into communist regimes, totalitarian rule, and brutal dictatorships. Whereas socialism has repeatedly led to famine and mass murders and the killing of over 100 million people worldwide. Whereas many of the greatest crimes in history were committed by socialist ideologues, including Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Pol Pot, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, Daniel Ortega, Hugo Chavez, and Nicolas Maduro. Whereas tens of millions died in the Bolshevik Revolution, at least 10 million people were sent to the gulags in the Union of Socialist Republics, or the USSR, and millions more starved in the terror famine in Ukraine. Whereas 15 million and 55 million people starved to death in the wake of famine and devastation caused by the Great Leap Forward in China. Whereas the socialist experiment in Cambodia led to the killing fields in which over 1 million people were gruesomely murdered. Whereas up to 3,500,000 people have starved in North Korea, dividing a land of freedom from a land of destitution. Whereas the Castro regime in Cuba expropriated the land of Cuban farmers and the business of Cuban entrepreneurs, stealing their possessions and their livelihoods and exiling millions with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Whereas the implementation of socialism in Venezuela has turned a once prosperous nation into a failed state with the world's highest rate of inflation. Whereas the author of the Declaration of Independence, President Thomas Jefferson, wrote, quote, "To take from one because it is thought that his own industry and that of his fathers has acquired too much in order to spare to others who or whose fathers have not exercised equal industry and skill is to violate arbitrarily the first principle of association, the guarantee to everyone of a free exercise of his industry and the fruits acquired by it," end quote. Whereas the father of the Constitution, President James Madison, wrote that it is, quote, "not just a government, nor is property secure under it, where the property which a man has in his personal safety and personal liberty is violated by arbitrary seizures of one class of citizens for the service of the rest," end quote. And whereas the United Snakes of America was founded on the belief in the sanctity of the individual, to which the collectivistic system of socialism in all its forms is fundamentally and necessarily opposed. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the House of Representatives, the Senate concurring, that Congress denounces socialism in all its forms and opposes the implementation of socialist policies in the United States, Snakes of America, passed by the House of Representatives February 2nd, 2023. So that is the concurrent resolution, HCon Res 9, denouncing the horrors of socialism. What say y'all?
All they did was put a bunch of words next to each other.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, you could just see like how the status quo, the establishment just pushes the whole rhetoric of individualism. Collectivism is bad because you can't exploit people and get rich. That's bad. Like the collectivist idea is failing, or it doesn't work. You know, look at Soviet Union and, you know, all this crazy stuff that they put out there. So yeah, it's kind of like what Salifu said, just a whole bunch of word salad, a whole bunch of nothing.
And unfortunately, it works because, and they're able to get away with this really low level elementary grade propaganda because they have groomed and conditioned a populace that isn't able to like parse through these lies for themselves. You know, we exist in this extremely anti-intellectual society. Most people don't learn anything true about socialism or communism or revolutions inside of other countries in school. So like there's no place for you to be able to sort through what you're being assaulted with every day.
And to your point too on anti-intellectualism, to the point of people not reading primary sources. Like they'll read a document like this, or they'll read about how a country got destabilized due to external forces, more so the West, which is typically the US, who has a strong hand in destabilizing socialist countries and say, oh, look, socialism didn't work there. And they just use that as a premise or as the basis of their analysis instead of reading primary sources, like Karl Marx or whatever, right? Like reading socialist thought. Because I believe in order to critique something, you have to go to the horse's mouth and see what exactly they're saying and what the framework is. And also judging things by their principles and not, as Kwame Ture always says, and not judging things by people who practice them, right? Like is the principles just like what are the principles saying of socialism or communist or socialist thought?
We have to definitely read between the lines of this concurrent resolution because in specific to the Castro regime in Cuba, expropriating the land of Cuban farmers and the businesses of Cuban entrepreneurs, stealing their possessions and their livelihoods, and exiling millions with nothing but the clothes on their backs. So in one sense, they're probably talking about the Mario boat lifts where they were like, oh, the criminals can go to Miami or whatever. You hate this country so much. Okay, go to America. So they're probably
here's some wood to build a boat.
Exactly. So you hate the revolution so much, go somewhere else. So there you go, all the criminals, etc. And of course, they're speaking about the revolution against the U.S. ally of Batista, the Batista regime, the fascist Batista regime. So I'm going to read this again. Whereas the Castro regime in Cuba expropriated the land of Cuban farmers and businesses of Cuban entrepreneurs, stealing their possessions and their livelihoods, and exiling millions with nothing but the clothes on their backs. So I'm going to read specifically the U.S. doing the same exact thing in reference to Cuba. But I wanted to say beforehand, one of my favorite things about The Godfather 2, the movie The Godfather 2, is that it totally discussed this, where the mafia was, and they were just kind of partying under Batista or whatever, and then the revolution happened and they were like, oh, wait, okay, we got to peace out. So that was a very interesting part. I don't think people really talk about with The Godfather, that a lot of these movies did talk about some of this stuff going on, about how the capitalist system was in line with a lot of these regimes. And when the masses fought against it, then you had the memorandum for the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs to the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. So this was a memo that was dated April 6th of 1960, Washington, D.C. It says, subject, the decline and fall of Castro. Salient considerations respecting the life of the present government of Cuba are: 1, the majority of Cubans support Castro. The lowest estimate I have seen is 50%. So that means majority supported Castro at that time, according to this memo. 2, there is no effective political opposition because the people participated in a revolutionary process to get the government they wanted. The U.S. clearly hated that. 3, Fidel Castro and other members of the Cuban government espouse or condone communist influence. 4, communist influence is pervading the government and the body politic at an amazingly fast rate. 5, militant opposition to Castro from without Cuba would only serve his and the communist cause. 6, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. So we see these things continuing with U.S. aid and all of these acronymed organizations throwing money behind arts programs, behind other organizations, behind businesses, etc., in order to destabilize a revolutionary government. It also says, if the above are accepted and cannot be successfully countered, it follows that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If such a policy is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. The US government is literally telling you what their plan is and what they have done around the world, whether it's Guatemala, whether it's Iran, I mean, do it Chile. I mean, there are plenty of places we can name. The same plan, Ukraine. So I mean, you have Project Aerodynamic. What was that? 1953, having to do with the stabilizing a revolutionary government in Ukraine. 1953, Project Aerodynamic. So all of these resolutions, these memorandums, the role of these memorandums is to put a plan in place to destabilize socialist and communist governments. So all these talking points about leading to killing fields and destabilizing businesses or whatever, we see the plans. You can, this is not coming from me. This is the words of the US government. So you can easily go to CIA.gov or whatever and look up these memorandums. This is not, again, coming from me or anyone else on this podcast. So when we read these resolutions, we have to understand what the underlying message is. And I'm going to even say overlying, because they're clearly telling you this is about individualism. And when you have collectivism, that means the individuals or the minority who have political and economic power no longer will have influence and power. So that's all this is about, is to destabilize people's movements, to destabilize mass movements. There's no other way around it. They're telling you, well, if the people have more power, we're just going to put a plan in place to starve people. And what is that? And people are like, well, the military, they promote democracy on the world. What kind of democracy is that? When you're stealing resources from people, when you're stealing land, when you're destabilizing a democratically elected government, who is the US to decide what democracy is for other places around the world? If anyone were to come and do that here, we already know what would happen. So what makes people think it's okay for the US to decide what the government of Ukraine should look like? So now it's a bunch of Nazis running it. So,
well, you know, China is flying a hot balloon here, so you know that means that
I wanted to bring this up so bad.
all right, let's talk about that. What's up?
Our people, my beautiful, lovely African people who I love from the bottom of my heart. Let's stop typing the words Chinese spy balloon. Let's stop doing it. China has no reason to spy on you, one, but two, even if they did, I promise you they wouldn't use a hot air balloon, guys. I promise you.
Yeah, they're more technically sound than that. I'm sure the country with the second largest economy, and first, according to some statistics like the PPP, purchasing parity power, already has them as number one economy in the world, but would not need to use a hot air balloon to spy on us. I'm sure. If the U.S. doesn't use that or doesn't use a tactic of that nature, I'm sure they wouldn't either. So yeah, I think another word we got to get people to ban is Chinese imperialism. That's another one that bothers me very well. We need to do away with those two. We need to do away with those two, please. I'm sorry.
I think we have to be really conscious of how the U.S. uses propaganda against other nations that it considers to be enemies to ramp up public support of the things that it's getting ready to do. I think that you got to consider, if you didn't already have a lot of reasons as a person to hate China, it would not be acceptable for the U.S. to do what it is attempting to do to China. You would say to yourself, this is wrong. This is morally wrong. They shouldn't do this. But because the U.S. is able to warp your image of what China is and what its intentions are, it dehumanizes China and Chinese people to an extent in your mind. And, you know, I'm not wishing for any negative things in the form of warfare to take place, but in the event that those things do happen, you've already been primed to accept them as necessary. You've already been primed to see Chinese people as sneaky and conniving. And so the US needed to do this on your behalf. That is what the US is doing right now with a very simple weather balloon that's just kind of floated out of orbit, that China promptly accepted responsibility for and began to like investigate immediately once it was observed. They're using this and adding it into a file cabinet in your brain that is helping you to dehumanize China and covertly support US war efforts against China. So you have to be very cognizant of how the empire plays with our minds.
And I have a question for folks who have not done any of this research and somehow believe in imperialist propaganda. So on one end, you talk about police terrorism in the US without recognizing the connection to the Zionist government of Israel training these same forces in the US. But, the international stuff has nothing to do with me. So do you not think that the tactics they are using on African people in the US don't apply to what the US does around the whole world? I just have that question for folks, that the US will stop at nothing to be a hegemonic force globally. It doesn't stop here. So your vote for Joseph R. Biden or whatever, do you really think that's just going to apply to what's happening here? Clearly not, if you haven't been paying attention to his role as a senator since the 70s, if that's the case.
Yeah, and another point too is there's a group of folks or people, whether they may be rad libs or maybe even more so further left than that, they understand or reject and say, oh, America is bad, everything they do is bad, we can't trust or believe them. But now when it comes to the stuff they say about Iran and every other global South country, is true. It's like, all right, which one is it? Like, that's an antagonism, at least to me. It's like, you can't say or espouse that, oh, America is the biggest liar, genocider, murderer, but then you imply that some other nation is bigger than them, or the fact that the US is telling the truth and what they're saying through their mass media imperialist mechanisms to, espouse truths, even though we know that which the person would just said that they're lying, like, but it's a crazy contradiction. And even to Salifu's point, in the sense of like them trying to normalize or manufacture consent for war, or invasion or whatever, they tend to like even play on emotions in various ways, whether it's films, because the media apparatus in all capacity, whether it's Hollywood or whether it's your nightly news or whatever the case is, they control all of that. So they make certain films or documentaries about how, oh yeah, like that Chinese entity in your neighborhood is exploiting all these Africans and blah 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 blah. So then that's why people then go ahead and start to adopt these state lines and rhetorics as well to further push that propaganda.
So to your point, I'm going to read a little bit from the book called The CIA in Hollywood, How the Agency Shapes Film and Television by Tricia Jenkins. It says, because of this history of secrecy, many outsiders were surprised by the CIA's decision to open its doors to the entertainment industry in the 1990s. But the end of the Cold War and the significant demise of two of the United States' most prominent enemies, communism and the USSR, demanded a new paradigm. Indeed, after the 1989 destruction of the Berlin Wall and the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, many questioned whether the CIA would be necessary in the new age, and the agency suffered from internal attrition. As Milt Bearden, the Soviet station chief during the Cold War, explains, it was easy once upon a time for the CIA to be unique and mystical. It was not an institution, it was a mission. And the mission was a crusade. Then you took the Soviet Union away from us and there wasn't anything else. End quote. In the absence of this mission, several officers soon left the agency. Indeed, outside intelligence analysts believe that CIA employment levels dropped from 20,000 near the end of the Cold War to 16,000 by 1997. a 20% staff reduction. The U.S.'s total budget for intelligence spending also decreased significantly during the decade. As the Federation of American Scientists illustrates, intelligence spending in 1990 had increased roughly 125% over the 1980 appropriation, but fell to only 80% increase over the same mark by 1996. Going on, it says, but the memorandums mentioned earlier also reveal that CIA faced a serious image problem and wanted to find a more media savvy way of enhancing its public support under the same guise of, quote, greater openness. One of the proposals put forth by the task force recognized the desperate need for a visible spokesperson, such as a DPAO, to refute media allegations and set the record straight. When such false allegations come from television, we need to be able to speak to them in the same forum. An agency spokesperson reading our statement in response to these allegations, it wrote, would have been more effective than Ted Koppel's reading of it with raised eyebrows and a look of, what do you expect given the source? The task force also argued that working with Hollywood could help the agency with its public image. It explained that the PAO had already reviewed some film scripts about the agency at the request of filmmakers seeking guidance on accuracy and authenticity. In a few instances, we facilitated the filming of a few scenes on agency premises. Responding positively to these requests in a limited way has provided PAO with the opportunity to help others depict the agency and its activities accurately and without negative distortions. Hollywood is the fourth wing of the government, or the entertainment industry specifically. Another use of a propaganda machine.
That's exactly why I think movies should have served the basis of our understandings of politics or the political world, because once again, that's just furthering the state line. Because as you stated, and as you proved through your citation there through the book, it's just another arm of the state apparatus. So you can't once again be saying all these things on like, oh yeah, like America's bad, America is, we shouldn't believe them or trust them, but then, cite their movies and stuff like that and use it as their understanding of what's going on around the world, the geopolitics or anything of that nature.
And getting back to this resolution, before we get into, I guess, what is the main subject of this episode, talks about the implementation of socialism in Venezuela, says has turned a once prosperous nation into a failed state with the world's highest rate of inflation. It's interesting that they're using these areas around the world that blockades or sanctions have greatly affected. So it's saying that socialism has killed and starved, etc., a bunch of people without explaining. Of course, they're not going to, but it doesn't describe the blockade that has happened, bloqueo that has happened upon Cuba. It doesn't talk about the mass sanctions that have been happening in North Korea and Zimbabwe. It doesn't discuss that. So to just outright look at this and go, well, yeah, that's what happened, without understanding the history and looking at these documents, which they literally lay out a plan talking about starving people. This is why you have to use a dialectical approach for everything. And so as what you're saying, Sadiq, US just totally bad and this good, that doesn't help the situation at all. Every single being, every single movement has its contradictions, and we need to look at all of those things. When the US literally is outright saying a person who the majority did not vote for is president, saying, Guaido, he was not elected by the majority, and yet the US is saying he's president. And they're saying here, socialist ideologues, Nicolas Maduro, but Nicolas Maduro is the rightful president. Whether or not you like it, the majority voted. This document, if you have no historical context, if you have no historical analysis, and you just look at this for what it is, you're going to be extremely misled, because there's a history behind this documentation. Again, go to CIA.gov, research a trilateral agreement, whatever. the government straight up has documents around these plans. So I just wanted to bring that in. And I don't know if y'all have anything to say before we get into the actual matter at hand.
Yeah, no, I think it's just back to the main point is I think we stressed throughout this whole thing. It's like going to the source and reading for yourself and not just listening to, solely what your friend said, secondary sources. Even though sometimes, not all secondary sources are bad, but it's always best to go back to the main source so you could understand, what is being said from the horse's mouth. Because even when people on the other side say, "Oh, Putin is bad, Mao was horrendous," or blah 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 blah, right? Like all these other progressive, whether socialist or just anti-imperialist leaders or movements, it's best to go listen to what they're saying themselves. Because if you know that the West is inherently bad and the source you read is from the people you claim are your enemies, then that's not a good way to shape your understanding, is to try to learn from your enemies, who their adversaries are. You need to learn from yourself and read what is being said or taught to you.
Once you listen to this episode, go out and read some books and do some research and go on the primary sources of the CIA, etc. They straight up tell you what their plan is. So getting into the primary subject of this episode, leading up to it, we're talking about ideological shifts one takes once joining a revolutionary organization. Comrade Sadiq, I'm going to ask you, what shifts do you see someone taking when they begin organizing with a revolutionary organization?
Yeah, I know for me, from a personal perspective, even organizing not only with this organization, but another organization, a more local organization, Build More Unity over here in Jersey. I've seen, more so speaking for myself take leaps and bounds. I came into this organization with some reactionary thoughts. I was reading, but I was reading in isolation. I never organized before or anything of that nature. So I came into this kind of like, oh, I know so much, and I know it all. And when I came into the org, I started seeing how politically sound cadre was. I was like, wait, hold up. I need to go back to the drawing board. I don't know as much as I thought I did, or I'll try to say some things, I would struggle with, and I'll be like, wait, what? Like, is this information not right? And then I have to go back to the drawing board. And also, too, we have a work study process. So that also helped me with the book list that we currently have. So with that, I think I was able to take the leaps and bounds from, maybe more so cultural nationalist to a true Pan-Africanist in my eyes, becoming a crewman, now capralist as well. So yeah, and I've seen this happen with comrades too, and the other orgs or just people I encounter as well through struggle, and even some friends too that I have in my personal life because of the process I've gone through in the A-APRP. It's taught me better how to struggle better as well. In that light. So, and they've been making leaps and bounds. They've joined an organization and they continue to make leaps and bounds. So that was really the premise why I was thinking of this topic. If you guys have a similar stories, then we could probably share that or something of that like in relation to ideological shifts when joining, or maybe if you know of people that have to as well.
I want to ask, I know that we've discussed this on previous episodes, but for those who may not be familiar with the terms, what is a cultural nationalist?
The way a lot of cultural nationalists look at culture, in my opinion, is that they look at it more of a static thing. Culture is the thing of like something in the past. When you think of cultural nationalism, you think of Milana Karenga. You could think of a few other folks aligned with him. I'm drawing a blanks right now. Kind of just like centering culture around everything and making that the primary contradiction and saying that, oh, we won't achieve power until we go back to our African roots and culture. Once again, looking at African culture as a static thing is something that is, just dormant when, as you know, culture is ever changing and evolving as well. Not saying that there won't be no need for a cultural revolution, but as someone who's a revolutionary Pan-Africanist, we know that in contrast to a cultural nationalist, in contrast to that, revolutionary Pan-Africanists understand that politics is the primary contradiction, land is the primary contradiction, as opposed to culture, because your culture can't thrive under a neo-colonial rule, right? You're only going to go so far with that. So we know that needs to be liberated first. We need to be liberated the land needs to be free, and then we could engage in cultural revolution and revitalizing our culture, and also understanding that culture isn't static. So that's just like the contrast between a revolutionary pan-Africanist and a cultural nationalist.
I think also one thing that tends to happen often with people who kind of catch the title cultural nationalist is that they tend to be like unscientifically utopian sometimes in their view of Africa. Like Sadiq said, culture becomes this one static thing, but African history also becomes this one static thing. And there's no space made for like class struggle in Africa. All of the history of Africa kind of gets lumped into this thing called African history, where everybody was doing the same thing from coast to coast, from the north to the south. And we just need to return to that. It's like an emphasis on return to this, like Sadiq said, static place. And because they are able to do that, what they are able to do is kind of ignore or conceal, one, the history of class struggle in Africa historically, but also the need for a class struggle inside of the African world today. So we can kind of all just like wear kente and like change our names and take an alkaline diet, you know, and like that is going to solve the problems of African people. I don't think there's anything wrong with taking an African name. I did. I love various African traditional clothing, but we cannot sidestep class struggle at all.
Having a myopic perspective on anything is going to massively set us back, especially if we identify as a revolutionary. The whole point of revolution is that it's constantly shifting based on material needs, based on social needs, based on what the masses want. You know, what the masses want today may not be what the masses want next week, because again, those needs are going to be different. So absolutely.
Yeah, and I think just understanding that in another sense that culture can be political too, in a sense, right? Like even what Salifu saying, he changed his name, like that is taking a political stance as well. I think sometimes with some cultural nationalists, they like to distinguish the two, you know, and try to separate it, but I think it's a dialectical relationship when we talk about culture and politics.
Yeah. Comrade Salifu, what's your relationship to an ideological shift when joining a revolutionary organization?
Man, okay. So I would say that for me personally, I have for the most part in my life been a person that is pretty averse to conflict. If I feel it is going to, I felt like it's going to cause a lot of like hoopla or argumentation, I just avoid it. Like I just would walk away or not even walk in the room because I don't like my thing was like I don't have time. I don't have time. I don't have time. I don't want to do this. And then upon joining a revolutionary organization, the first thing I get introduced to is combat liberalism.
Perfect text to start.
And in combat liberalism, it points out all these like small ways in our lives that like we allow conflict to fester, to grow, to overtake our aims and defeat progress. And the notion of avoiding conflict is like right there. It's like plainly stated, like to say nothing. I can't remember exactly what it is. Basically, in paraphrasing it, is like to say nothing when you know that something should be said, or like when you know that something is wrong, and to choose the avoiding the conflict as opposed to directly struggling with it. That is something that I have had to learn, something that I am still learning, that I'm not great at, but I have noticed like a marked improvement in the quality of my relationships, in the quality of the work that I try to do, like as an individual person, as a teacher, and as like an organizer in the party and in other organizations I'm a part of. But just reading that couldn't be enough. I think reading it and then being in organization with people who like have also read combat liberalism, so they understand that it is their job and their function to press you on that, to like make sure that I'm not being conflict avoidant and like push me towards struggling, has made a huge impact in my life.
I wanted to ask you what would be ideologically a difference between the see something, say something statement versus fighting or battling conflict avoidance that a lot of us are trained or ingrained to perform.
Oh yeah, that's a really good question, comrade. Thank you. So I think a large part of the reason why I have been conflict avoidant in my life is because I grew up around people who are like very confrontational. That's been like a large part of growing up for me.
Same,
And so what I have observed is that there can be an issue, and speaking about it causes such a bigger issue. But I think when you learn to struggle with people, you learn that there's like a context for struggle, and you learn that there's like certain pretext for struggle. And what I mean is that, like, one, you have to establish that you are going to raise this thing, or you're going to talk about this thing with good intentions. So you're not entering these struggles in bad faith. That's like the first thing. You're deciding to yourself that I'm going to speak up about this thing because I want to have a positive influence on this, because either this will allow the work that we do to be better, this will help me become a better person, or I think I can help you become a better person. So your intentions are good. You have good, positive, clean intentions for why you are choosing the struggle. And then the way you approach the struggle then becomes totally different, where it's not like a situation where, you know, the things that I've seen growing up, where it's like you flip the table and you yell and you throwing your hands in the air and you trying to like drive somebody off the side of the road. Like, it's not that. You're literally saying, person to person, comrade to comrade, in the appropriate context. Maybe sometimes that's in front of other people, maybe that's sometimes one-on-one, with a clear, calm voice, especially if it's your first time raising a struggle, not making accusations, asking questions, allowing people to express back to you how they feel about the conversation that you're having. All of these things have play such a big part in how you combat liberalism, because raising struggle is not the same as like being unnecessarily antagonistic toward people. Because I think culturally, and especially in the US, we grow up in a strong culture of like, I don't take shit from nobody, I'll slap everybody in here, like, you know what I mean? That is that's antagonistic, not combat. And that in itself is liberalism, right? Because you are creating space to create issues that never get resolved. You have no intention of resolving the issue. So that in itself is another form of liberalism. So even in gaining the courage to struggle with people, I've also had to learn how to do so in effective ways. And I think that's something that you can only get good at, like I said, through practice.
Yeah. I mean, as a person who also grew up in a toxic environment, and many of us who have grown up in toxic environments just sort of wither in the corner and just don't want to start trouble because it's going to be at our expense. But people who do live in either toxic family environments or people who straight up live in the hood, we're always being told, see something, say something, without understanding, getting back to the class analysis, who defines what crime is. It's usually the onus being on us to report crime without understanding the social connections to that crime, the political connections to that crime. So when we have this culture and this ethos of see something, say something, of course, there's things where, obviously, if there are child predators or something, there are extraneous situations where perhaps the community doesn't have the facilities to really deal with it. So again, everything's dialectical, including the relationship with the police. So there might be situations which are not safe for us to deal with ourselves, and we don't have a lot of choices. but I'm speaking more about the ethos itself and the culture around see something, say something versus struggling. So as you were talking about, and I grew up in a similar toxic environment where you just didn't say anything because you didn't want to put yourself in a situation, or you didn't want anything happening at your expense. And because speaking up, there would be consequences. So there's that. But again, we're being encouraged to speak up based on socialized ideas of what crime are.
Well, and I don't know if this is at all related to what you are pointing out here, but I think a part of the ethos of like see something, say something is not necessarily about considering how the conflict is resolved or the best possible outcome for speaking. It's just encouraging you to speak. And I think that when we talk about how ideology guides us toward like combating liberalism, we're talking also about like full investigation of what it is that we're about to speak about.
Because there's a huge difference, and a lot of people misinterpret what Malcolm X, Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz says about how Africans should handle particular businesses on our own terms amongst each other versus the reactionary no snitch code. So again, a lot of this is dialectical. This is not like, oh, anything that happens, we should go to the police. But and when people do talk about no snitch, it's very reactionary how people look at it versus we need to handle this as a community of people versus like, well, it's none of my business, I'm not going to snitch. So there's a huge difference. So if there is a predator in the community, I forget, y'all have social media, I don't know, but who was it, Akon or so, I can't remember who it was, but he was asked about a predator being next door and he was like, it's none of my business, I don't snitch.
Cameron.
Right. So that's what I mean, like
Cameron.
a very reactionary response. Like how people use don't snitch is very reactionary versus something that's solutions oriented, whereas like if there's a predator in our community, the community is going to deal with it. So to me, the conflict avoidance is sort of along the lines of how people look at no snitching or there's no snitch codes. Cameron's response wasn't like, oh wow, there's a predator, we're going to figure out how to deal with this as a community and we're going to figure out a solution. It's just like, well, it's not about business, I don't snitch, so if he's doing something, it's not on me. And so I think that we have to deal with that and make the distinctions. So I'm not saying, again, we're talking about polar opposites here. So it's like somebody saying, I don't like Obama. Oh, that means you're voting for Republican. People tend to think in binaries. So if you've been listening to this podcast at all, you understand we do not think or talk in binaries. We have to understand the contradiction of the no snitch ethos, because it's just as reactionary how people are conditioned to use it, how people tend to discuss it. It's not solutions oriented. People like Cameron who use it are not coming up with solutions where the community can deal with it. People like Cameron are not discussing community defense at all, which should be the solution, which does happen in places. And I have participated in it. So when we talk about these things, we have to understand what that really means. So by you saying, I'm not going to snitch, that person's still being victimized by a predator.
Well, Sadiq, I feel like the scenario that Jamilah is describing here is also is something that we consider to be individualism, which we ideally revolutionary organization would also be pushing you away from as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's what I started to learn too, is like coming into this once again, like reading on my own and just feeling like, oh, I could solve and know all the answers by just struggling with myself. Even though I didn't even know the concept of struggle, I was just like thinking that subconsciously. Doing it in the collective was way better. Trying to figure out ideas, and you start to figure out certain tasks get done quicker and more efficiently when you have other people with you, right? And it's even in the context of the conversation of dealing with, reactionaries in a said and, neighborhood or whatever the case is. We shouldn't look at it from a Superman perspective of one or two people or a selective. It should be a community thing, right? Everyone can take a role in dealing with any problems in any society. Community should be the center of everything and how we engage in everything, because as people that make up the community, without the community, we're nothing. We can't solve anything. We're all social beings as humans. We all teach each other. The reasons why we believe what we do is because we've been socialized by a community to believe what we believe for the most part. Whether it's good or bad, that's just the nature of things. So, irregardless of, what may be going on in the community, it should be centered around that, just understanding that, because someone can be specialized in something that you're not specialized in and vice versa. And that's how you fit the puzzle piece together, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's talk about struggle for a little bit, because struggle's also individualized. So when we approach struggle from a revolutionary standpoint, ideologically, struggle is a huge aspect in helping us grow, not only as individuals, but as mass organizers. Versus, and I have to remember this a lot of the time, because we're all doing this type of work, but there's a whole world out there. And so when we begin to struggle with people who aren't doing this work, it just seems so daunting. It's like, why am I getting a headache just struggling with you? I think people who don't do this work look at struggle as something negative, and people look at it as a fight. And so I like to make a distinction between a struggle over ideas and what they call a debate, because debates tend to be, at this stage of the game, like based on ego, based on individual ideas of you having to be right. And so the thing when struggling from a revolutionary ideological perspective, yeah, you want to be able to show people that your perspective and your analysis is a correct one, but it also comes with the reality that our perspectives and analysis may not be the correct one. So we have to understand we ain't always going to be right. The thing when we individualize what a struggle is, it's like we're fighting to the death until you see my point. And that's just not healthy. And so I just know whenever I talk to people not doing this work and we're struggling, people come with straw man arguments or attacks, or it's like, well, the big one is, well, if you hate capitalism so much, how come you have a job? Or, that's just an example. It's people don't understand the system we live under, or either they're rationalizing it as okay. And so they're arguing with you without having studied these systems. The reason we understand why capitalism is so damaging to humanity is because we've studied it. And so someone who hasn't, and they somehow have a point and they think they're right, this is what tends to happen. Either both of you can talk about your experiences with that, or what that means to you and what struggle means for you.
Yeah, I think you said it the best. It's like, I struggle with people just not because like I feel as though I'm superior, so chauvinistic or whatever. I'm struggling, it's a battle of ideas. Like, I'm coming into this off of the material that I know, like a materialist analysis or dialectical materialist analysis as much as I can. And I'm open to being wrong, like, certain pockets, like, hey, if I'm wrong in this, but I'm standing on principle too, as well. Like, I'm trying to engage in it in a principled manner. I think that's one thing that delineates this from other types of, like, I guess, arguments or debates or whatever, right? Like, is that I'm going to stick to the topic. I'm going to stick to this. Sometimes you even see debates, I guess, presidential debates and stuff. You see they take personal shots and they go all over the place and they try to make it more, they get off topic. They try to make it more of a personal thing sometimes, when in revolutionary spaces, that is liberalism in a way. Is to go back to what Salifu was talking about earlier with combat liberalism. You're supposed to stay and be principled on the said topic. This is what we're talking about. This is the idea. I'm not going to talk about your hair or you ain't see your kids in 3 years. So I ain't gonna bring that up. We're gonna talk about this is what this is what we talking about. This is the topic, and this is what we're gonna struggle over. And it's just gonna be a struggle. And to be honest, sometimes I may need to go back to the drawing board and do some more homework. That the other person may say that to themselves too, like, oh, okay, I need to go back and do my homework on this because I don't know enough. Because no one knows everything. I'm sorry, as much as you think I don't care. You could have your doctorates and X, Y, and Z. I'm sure there's a blind spot in something that you don't know in relation to politics or history or whatever. It's impossible to really, unless you spent 70, 60 years doing nothing but reading your whole life and doing nothing, locking yourself in a house for like years. I think even then you may still not know anything. So the only way we could advance is if we struggle as a collective as people, because there's always someone that knows more than you. So nothing is going to advance without struggle with people as well. I don't want to speak for everyone in the A-APRP or most people or anything like that, but I think a lot of people who join the A-APRP at some point had to engage in some struggle, with comrades in the party, certain content that they came across, whether it's like party literature, propaganda, or something like that, or whatever. But they had to probably engage in some type of struggle before they joined, internally, externally, or something. There's that saying, without struggle, there's no process, there's no progress.
One thing that I'm interested in learning more about, because I've heard a few elders reference it recently, is the concept of like unity, struggle, unity, or like unity, struggle, transformation as like a basis for how we approach struggle. And if I'm not mistaken, one, you guys may understand it better than I do because I'm newly learning about it, but it seems like to me the basis of it is you enter the struggle on the basis of the things that you are united on, and you use those points of unity to unpack the struggle, which is like the places where there is like disunity, and then you move forward based on the transformation that comes out of the struggle. To me, that sounds like a really cool framework to be operating from. And I'm interested in seeing how I can practice that on a very practical level.
To your point, I want to ask both of you about something Comrade Jackie Lukman was talking about. She was addressing this libertarian event that was coming up. The idea that revolutionary organizers should connect with the more reactionary of particular groups based on a unity of one thing, so anti-war. My response to that, if someone's requesting I work with someone despite them not having a principled approach, for instance, someone being a racist or white supremacist, you could be anti-war all day, but if you do not respect or acknowledge my existence, why should I be made to work with you? And that's the only response that I would give to that. So I wanted to ask the both of you about a principled approach versus a reactionary approach. And when you're talking about a unity of particular ideas or ideals, what approach do you think we should take in terms of unity on these ideas? Do y'all think that we should just work with every single individual or group who, may claim to be anti-imperialist? Or I'll say anti-war because there are people anti-war but are not necessarily anti-imperialist. So say anti-war. So it's like we don't want the U.S. to invade a particular country, for instance. That happens a lot. But there's some liberal organizations that are not necessarily anti-capitalist and have some white supremacist factions within them. What would be y'all's take on that in terms of being having a principled approach versus a reactionary approach? So that's one part of the question. And the other question is, what would be your response to someone requesting that we work with folks who do not particularly take that principled approach, despite there being unity on a certain objective?
It all stems for me what principles they stand for. Like if they are antagonistic to my principles, and it's, like one thing I'm not compromising on is, me being anti-imperialist or anti-Zionist or, socialist, right? Like granted, you don't have to be socialist, but if what you're espousing is in complete opposition to any type of communal, egalitarian society, I don't think I would be for it. If it's, and the only antithesis of that is capitalism. So you have to be for capitalism in a way, because there's really only two ways to go about it. It's either you're going to be capitalist or you're going to be the socialist in your mode of thinking or whatever. So yeah, that's how I would look at it. And I guess in this scenario, I guess them having white supremacists, being racist is in opposition to my ideology and my principles. So there's no way I could really work with that, to be honest. There's no antagonisms there. Yeah, I could work with it. I think we could work with any organization that is not antagonistic to our objective or to our principles as a party, or even as an individual. But yeah, I can't work with the Democratic Party, or I can't work with the KKK in no shape, way, or form, in my opinion. Me personally.
I largely agree with that. I don't know who it is that has the quote, and I don't remember the quote in this entirety, but it's essentially about struggling with like the willing and not wasting time on the backwards. I think that, we got to be efficient with our time out here, man. Like, if we understand imperialism is the primary contradiction that we are facing today, I'm gonna always keep that enemy in mind. But there are definitely hard lines that I think we have to say on a day-to-day basis. How much time do I have? What am I struggling toward? I'm not wasting time with white supremacists. That's not my lane of struggle. And I also don't know how fruitful those struggles will even be. And in that time that I'm struggling with like white supremacists or transphobes or homophobes, like what other work could I have been a part of that would actually be moving the needle on freeing Africa, on defeating imperialism? So I think that we have to also look at it from that perspective as well. Those forces, those reactionary forces, those backwards forces, instead of focusing on trying to struggle with them, we just need to out-organize them.
I think it's really important that we make the distinction between reactionary ideologies and revolutionary ideologies. And so that is something we have discussed on various episodes, but let's quickly just define that again for folks who may not have heard those episodes.
Revolution in itself deals with uprooting or complete overhaul of the current status quo in ethics, morals, principles, values, etc. So you can't claim to be revolutionary, but you want the same political system as the US. You want to maintain capitalism. You want to maintain imperialism, which includes the plunder of global South nations, which capitalism includes the exploitation of people's labor and things of that nature. You can't say you're for that and you're revolutionary, right? Like, this is a side, this would probably be in a whole different episode in itself. This is why I claim that the quote unquote American Revolution wasn't really a revolution, quote unquote, because slavery still existed, capitalism was still here. So yeah, it's nothing that really changed in its ethics, morals, or values or systems. So with that being said, I guess revolutionary thoughts would be more progressive, more, at least in a position of like the United States or the West, because all these countries in the West espouse capitalism, imperialism, exploiting people and their resources and labor, versus reactionary would be someone who's against that progress, someone who's more conservative in their thinking and wants to maintain those ethics, those morals, those values for the most part, either consciously or subconsciously. Sadiq Ture talks about it, anti-revolution versus counter-revolutionary. Most people are reactionary in thought, right? And that's the anti-revolutionary. But once you take action against that, that will make you a counter-revolutionary, because you're taking a conscious effort to, subvert revolution in a way. Yeah, I think those are the two distinguishing things, and those two are antagonistic to each other. And I think when we struggle with people, we have to understand that our people, because the people in power disseminate their reactionary thoughts through propaganda, as you were referring to earlier through your book, at Hollywood, as through school systems, through the books, et cetera, that is the main dominant ideology of society. So we need to understand that these people aren't consciously or inherently reactionary. It's just the political system wants to keep it intact. So they obviously disseminate their thoughts and values and inculcate it into the masses. So it's our job as revolutionaries to help them and get the proper analysis into, hey, you should probably stop wanting to be exploited. It's not in your favor, right?
I think that was perfectly said.
So to round this out, what would be some solutions for folks to get off the reactionary train, move towards a more revolutionary train?
If you African, join the A-APRP, join any other organization fighting for justice, join their work study process, and all that. Struggle collectively. You can't do it on your own. You're not a superhero. You won't do it on your own. Trust me. You can try as hard as you want to. You're just gonna be more frustrated. And I think that's what tends to happen is when you're not an organization and you don't have a collective to not only struggle with, but even people who are on the same ideological plane as you. Because there's plenty of times where, we talk about stuff that we experience in this backward society. And I think without that sense of community or, people, it kind of could just leave you feeling like pessimistic and feeling like I'm about to be an Afro pessimist on the other side. It's good in various ways. Not only is it refreshing to, know that you're fighting for something bigger than yourself. You're doing it with your comrades, with other people. That's the only way we're going to achieve what you want to achieve is through the collective. So join an organization. I'm biased, so definitely if you're African, join A-APRP. But if you don't like, what we're saying, or you feel like we're not the right line, then find another organization you feel as though, but just don't join one that's reactionary, that's against progress.
So I totally agree with Sadiq that like people should join organizations. One thing that I will say, and I'm curious to know if you guys agree or disagree with me, but I think that there is perhaps a like half step that many people should take before they consider joining organizations. I think that you should like just self-evaluate quickly. Like, are you tired? You need to ask yourself, I think, are you tired of the way things are? Whether that's with you personally, internally, with your surroundings and your family, at your job and your community. And if you're tired of the way things are, then I think you need to consider what it means to do something different. And I think you need to like submit mentally and emotionally and spiritually at that point to trying to do something different. Like just say to yourself, the way I've been doing things actually isn't working. So I really don't have anything to lose at this point. Let me try something different. And then do exactly what Sadiq said, which is like, try the process of joining an organization with an open mind. Go into it and be willing to like do the study, go into it and be willing to like try new ways of struggling with people. Don't just go to it and assume that joining the organization is the thing that's going to solve the problem. And you don't have to do any work inside the organization. You don't have to do any work internally. You just have to join it. That's not what we mean. Mm-hmm. You have to joining an organization is a process of like transformation, and you have to be open to being transformed.
You led me to a question I want to ask y'all because there's that connection with the fear of conflict, the conflict avoidance. To me, just from what I've seen, that's one of the reasons why people do not join revolutionary organizations. Because like, well, that'll put me at risk of this, that, or the other. I may lose my job. Whether or not you're in a revolutionary organization, like we're at risk under capitalism for all of that. So what would be some ways to convince someone to join a revolutionary organization, because the image we have of that is, Fred Hampton. The image we have of that is the wicker chair or people with guns, or it's, and so people do see that as reactionary because they don't see the work put into that. They don't see the political education programs put into that, the medical programs. They don't see the real work happening. They just see what they look at as the end result or just the visuals. And then when people look at this type of organizing, it's like, well, I have to be in the streets every day. I don't have time for that. And I have 10 kids. And people idealize, even though they may not see themselves as idealizing what revolutionary organizing is, they are doing that in a way to talk themselves out of it. And they don't necessarily see it as a priority because there's this fear that's eating at them, like, well, I'm going to be seen out there. And so they're like, I know something needs to be done, but you're doing it. You're better than me. And so there's this, again, way of talking themselves out of it. So what would be something y'all would say to somebody that would either convince someone to join a revolutionary organization, or just to get them to think about it, or to think about why it would be beneficial for them?
It just depends, because it's not. I used to think it was a one size fits all. Like I could say one thing and it's like, oh yeah, they're gonna want to join. I think it's just dependent on the type of person, their personality, where they are ideologically, how they view just politics in general, which it kind of just goes into the whole where they are ideologically too. But yeah, I think it's just understanding all those things and then knowing what angles. Like I've learned in in the 2 years, going 3 years that I've been organizing, that you kind of have to just find people on angles, find those right conversations, or find something that piques their curiosity, and then try to use that as a vehicle to start talking about political stuff and struggle with them on that said topic, right? And sometimes it's not always one conversation. Sometimes it may take multiple conversations to have with people. It's funny because I don't know if I told the story on one of the podcast episodes before, but like a year, like 2 years ago, I think it was, year and a half or something like that, I ran into someone at a bookstore. He, we were just chopping it up. I never met him before, whatever. I think he said something like reactionary about China, and then I quickly struggled with him on that. It was a quick struggle, and he was like, "Oh wow, okay, I never thought about it like that." And then, we exchanged information, and then he was like, "Man, so glad that I came across you." And we kind of stayed in contact. It's kind of more my fault. I should have stayed more in contact with him, but those little bits and pieces right there is something that can move the needle a little bit. And who knows, that person may have joined an organization, or if I continue to struggle with them, the person possibly more than likely would have possibly joined an organization, because they weren't averse to the idea. It was just, they just needed a little struggling to take place. So yeah, that's how I look at it though.
No, I totally agree with that. Being consistent, being consistent, trying to meet them where they are. And of course, I would ask them that same question: have the things you've done worked? No? Okay, let's try something else.
Yeah. Or my other go-to line is, you should organize around that, knowing that the person more than likely isn't going to, and then just following up and asking why they have it, and continue to struggle through there.
I'll just say really quick, because I don't think you mentioned my take on ideological shifts. So I've been pretty open since the age of 10. I've been anti-capitalist in one form of fashion. The thing is, I think, Salifu, you were talking about just studying. I think both of you talk about just reading and studying. But I think building analysis didn't really happen for me, or fine-tuning and analysis didn't really happen for me until I started organizing with the A-APRP. I organized with other groups. I, again, just did reading groups, did all that kind of stuff. And it was like, great, Marx is great, just looking at anarchism, just all sorts of these systems and ideas. And it just didn't really make sense to me in bringing sort of a real life approach to it, because I didn't have groups of people that I studied with. And I think once you have groups of people you study with, and obviously people are going to bring their experiences into it, becomes much more real world. And that's when it started to make sense to me. And there's a lot of stuff. I've been organizing with the A-APRP going on 10 years, and there's still things I'm like, oh, wait, okay. So as we're all talking about, we're not going to know everything, no matter how long we've been doing this. So that really did have an ideological shift for me, in that it fine-tuned my analysis, where I can speak confidently about a particular ideological stance I take on something. So, and, I think obviously, there was a point, even though I was studying all these things, I was still pretty liberal and conflict avoided. And so I had that as well. Even though I was along the trajectory of anti-capitalism, there's still liberalism you can perform within that. So that's really quick my experience. And I mean, we're gonna have to continue fighting liberalism every day of our lives as long as we're here. So with that said, please, yes, indeed, join an organization. If you don't like what's going on where you are in the world, in your community, whatever that is, the US war machine, whatever that is for you, join an organization fighting that, and fight liberalism within that, and fight your own liberalism, fight the liberalism within the organizations, etc. So as Sadiq mentioned, A-APRP is one of those organizations. You're African. There are plenty of other revolutionary organizations. We can help you with that. If you have any questions, we can help you find somewhere where you feel that you can do this work, because that's really what it's about, is doing the work, not just being an organization in name only. And we have other comrades doing this type of content. So we have our Ancestors' Voices on Sundays. Every other week, there is the African News Hour. And then we have Revolutionary African Women. And we also have the Forward Ever podcast. There's also the Forward Ever shop. If you want a hoodie, you're like, hey, I love my people and doing the work to liberate my people, we have the Forward Ever shop. If you love someone who's doing the work, but they don't have a hoodie, get them a hoodie, get them a shirt, get them whatever it is you think that will show and prove your work that you are doing to liberate our people, in turn liberating all people, because we can't forget that it's a domino effect, y'all. And there's also the Thomas Sankara Center. So there's a lot of ways we are doing this work in Burkina Faso, in Guinea-Bissau, in Ghana, in the Caribbean, in the UK. Like we're all over the place, y'all. So yeah, please, if you don't join the A-APRP, just join another organization that, again, you feel like you're going to do this effective work, because that's what's most important. And as we end with every single episode, forward ever, backwards never.
Forward.
Forward.